Hello, Rob Watson here. It's a lovely summer's day, August the 10th. Another set of warm days coming up, and it seems appropriate that we should be talking at this week's Community Media's Makers Zoom drop-in about climate change and about the role that community media can play in promoting decarbonisation. So we're going to have our usual conversation, which is from 6 p.m. on Thursday evening. To get the link, go to decentered.co.uk and you'll find the link for Patreon there. You can subscribe and join us each week for a conversation about what community media can and does do in relation to supporting positive social change. So we're going to talk about decarbonisation, and I was at an event last week where I was helping out record some other podcasts, and it was really inspiring, and I wanted to kind of get in quite quickly and get some thoughts down and find out what kind of opinions other people have about this process. Really the idea that if we're going to successfully transition the economy and society from where we are now as a largely carbon-based society, there's going to be a whole load of things that we need to think about, that we're going to need to talk about, that we're going to need to do in order to bring about that change. And my concern is that our industrial media, our mass media, is in no way able or capable of supporting and facilitating that change. Similarly, our social media is just going to create division and misinformation and antagonism, and I don't think we'll be in a position where we can come to a consensus and we can deliberate and we can learn from one another as to how change might be managed. In a sense, what I would be keen to, and listening to the discussions last week, and when they're posted online, I will be sharing the link and I'll be inviting people in to help discuss the topic. But I'm much more pragmatic. I think you can bring about a huge amount of change, but you have to go one step at a time. So it might be the right thing to do to call for immediate and far-reaching change, but without a plan in place of how you're going to achieve that, just protesting, although it is incredibly important and I support the right to protest, it is also problematic, because what we really need in place are clear examples of how those changes can benefit and enhance our lives. And the danger is that without that deliberative support, then we leave ourselves open to the people who scaremonger and the people who will catastrophize and the people who will seek to serve their own narrow interests rather than the collective good. So we've got to get in there. It's a social democratic issue about legitimacy, about trust, and about managing change in a way which is beneficial for all, but doesn't fall on the shoulders of the least able or the weakest, the poorest, but is has an ethical and moral dimension to ensure that we put in place a whole raft of policies, practices, and we've got to think about this, I suppose, in terms of different levels. There's things that we can do as individuals, but they can only take us so far. There's things that we can do collectively as civic society groups and mutual aid groups working together. There's things that we can do as businesses. There's things that we can do as public organisations, larger businesses, public authorities, and then there's things that we have to do with a framework that's created by government. None of which means that we shouldn't do anything, that we have to be thinking of ways in which we can bring about this change. However, the question that is usually omitted from this discussion is, what is the role of our media in this process, and in what way does our media contribute towards this change? And I think I've used the analogy, and I think it's kind of forming in my mind really as a really good analogy as to how we define media. We use the term mass media a lot, and I think maybe a better way of thinking about this is industrialised media. And really the idea that what we want to seek and see some change on the basis of is that our media becomes something is not controlled by a committee in London, as the BBC largely is run. It's not controlled by international corporations and conglomerates, as commercial media organisations are run, but it's something which is local, which is embedded in people's neighbourhoods and towns and cities and places where they live, where there's direct access and an opportunity to be directly involved in the process of shaping discussion, telling stories, reporting on issues, considering in a creative, engaging way how we might deal with this massive challenge. You know, it feels at the moment, because we've got a particularly hot summer and a dry summer, but we can see and look at some of the images that we see from around the world and the sustained drought that Europe, it's a continent-wide issue. You know, climate change doesn't respect national boundaries, but it has particular effects in local places that are different than, you know, poor areas are affected very differently from wealthy areas. But what I think is the crucial, again, another kind of part of the challenge for adaptation is the, you know, our experience is finite, but our imagination is infinite. And we've got to be able to come up with some ways of reimagining how we do things, how we engage with things. I mean, we've got a small example here of a communal seating area here in Leicester. It's in Green Dragon Square, where people can sit and have a coffee, bring their lunch, but it's not shaded on a day like this, and it's quite hot, so I'm not sure how many people would be out. In the winter, we're facing a cost of living crisis, which is part of a knock-on impact from the Ukrainian war and the shift away from Russian gas supplies. So we're looking at local councils, charities, planning and thinking about opening warm banks where people can go to stay warm, rather than, because they can't afford to heat their home, individual homes. So it's going to force us to think through both individual and collective issues along the way. You know, the change to the nature of the way that we use transport in our cities. You know, the dominance of the motor car and the dominance of you know, private transport as opposed to public transport or sustainable transport in terms of cycling and walking and buses and trams and those kind of things. Now, what's right for one area might not be right for another area, but it's the impact and whose voices are heard in this discussion, which I think is one of the main issues that we need to be able to use and focus community media around is, you know, in the climate crisis, are the voices of our children being heard? Are older people, disabled people, people who are, you know, traditionally don't have a strong voice and are not likely to get a job or even get a hearing by the BBC or by a commercial broadcaster because they're not in the mainstream of society. And I think that's a real, one, it's a shame, two, it's a waste of valuable resources, but three, it's also indicative of a kind of top-down process which is grinding to, feels like at the moment, it's grinding to a halt. And one of the answers and the solutions to this process is to encourage and incorporate more people in the process of discussion, debate and deliberation. And I think things like community newspapers, community newsletters, community radio, community video channels have all got this role to play in sharing people's stories based on their experience. And it's useful to talk about the difference between what people care about. I care about the environment because I watch David Attenborough type programs, and what I care for. Now, I have some pots in my yard that I tend and I look after, and I get a great sense of enjoyment from doing that because I'm engaging with nature. And that was one of the messages that came out from about decarbonisation, that we've got to start somewhere. And in our urban environment, that might mean something as simple as community beds engaged. This is what happens in Evington, the Evington Echo, the Evington in Bloom project is community-focused gardens where people can get involved and build relationships and talk with other people who are interested in some, you know, engagement with the natural world and not waiting for somebody to supply it and do it on our behalf. So, for example, I have a local Tesco supermarket, and actually there are very few places where I can go to buy bedding plants in Leicester, surprisingly, because I don't drive. So I can't drive around the garden centres that are on the outskirts of the city or to the big chain DIY stores. But if Tesco's is the only place that I can buy bedding plants, and they don't particularly look after them. It looks like a lot of them die of dehydration. It's an incredible waste. And I'm really surprised that they allow it to happen, because it's not a good advert for a huge corporation that you can't tend and look after a few plants. I'll see if I can take some photos. They're probably all gone now, but it has over the summer. It's been quite disappointing to see racks upon racks of dehydrated, dying bedding plants that could be in people's gardens if they were affordable, or if they were given, almost effectively given away, rather than a premium price for them. But what I'm trying to get at is that, do we need large corporations to tell us what we plant in our gardens? And I think it's a really good analogy. The community gardening approach is a really good analogy that fits with the idea that community media is a lot like running a community garden. You want to get people involved, you want to get people taking responsibility, you want to get people learning about the way the process of growing things works, about when to apply, if you're doing it organically, when to apply compost, when to prune. All of these things are factors which, sit in the process is the same for our media. You have to learn how to nurture and grow and develop our stories that we tell as a community. So I see there's a great link between the two. On the one hand, I think the decarbonisation process is going to challenge us a lot, and it's going to force us to think things through very interesting ways, and we need some imagination, but we need space where we can learn to express that imagination and to engage with each other creatively and sympathetically, and we can understand the experiences that we all have and the needs that we're all driven by, rather than, if you like, maybe just listening to a whole set of fatuous opinions which we're free to express on social media, and Lord knows I do that. So it's the difference between considering what we care about and considering what we care for. How do you care for your local environment? How do you care for your local neighbourhood? Part of that process is for the telling of community and the sharing of community stories, community experiences, community discussion, and it's with a purpose. And I think this is what the mainstream industrial media lacks. I think the BBC lacks a sense of purpose around social change, and where we can lead the way with community media is to start having some of these conversations and look at ways that we can repurpose our media to deal with some of these social challenges, because we have to do that quite urgently, and we have to do it in a way that includes and takes people along with us rather than excludes and divides us. Anyway, so if you want to take part in our conversation, as I say, you can go to decentered.co.uk. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Decentered Media. If you want to sign up on Patreon, go to patreon.com /Decentered Media. But we're going to have a chat on Thursday. Hopefully you can join us, and speak to you soon.